Welcome. Almost 80 years ago, on January 27th, 1945, Soviet soldiers liberated Auschwitz. There, they discovered approximately 7,000 men, women, and children, a handful of survivors out of the millions who were forced through the gates of Auschwitz, a remnant of a people who barely escaped extinction. Since 2005, January 27th, the day of the liberation, has become International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This year, with the images of October 7th fresh in our minds, the relevance of this day is so much stronger. Today is the 6th annual ceremony of our unique The Hague-based commemoration, focused on the impact of the Holocaust on the development of international law. Excellencies, ambassadors, judges, rabbis, representatives of the City of The Hague, representatives of the courts of law, the universities, scholars, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Laura Renberg-Dunkelgrün, and on behalf of Hague, the Cultural and Educational Foundation of the Jewish Community of The Hague, welcome. The booklets on your chairs contain the program for this evening's ceremony. It is my privilege to start the evening with a welcome video by the Mayor of The Hague, the Honorable Jan van Zanen.
Dear all, it was in 2005 that the United Nations General Assembly designated International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This day is commemorated worldwide on or around the 27th of January, the day on which Auschwitz was liberated, including The Hague. And for a good reason. The first peace conference was held here 125 years ago. This marked the start of The Hague's journey to becoming the international city of peace and justice. And as such, The Hague symbolizes humanity's will to prevent crimes against humanity, by holding, for instance, perpetrators accountable and bringing justice to the victims. Besides which, The Hague and its people suffered greatly during World War II. More than 12,000 Jewish residents of The Hague were murdered in Nazi death camps. About 63 Sinti and Roma from The Hague also died in Auschwitz. And the victims included more than 2,000 children. Children like Greetje Cohen and her little brother Jaap. Greetje and Jaap lived with their parents on the Berberisstraat in The Hague. Father Isaac was a tailor, Mother Hannah a bookkeeper. In the autumn of 1942, the family was sent to Westerbork transit camp. A postcard from Mother Hannah survives from that time, in which she writes about the dire situation in the camp, which was very overcrowded at that time. By telegram, she asks friends to send food that would never reach them. The family was deported to Auschwitz on October 16, 1942, where Greetje, Jaap and their mother were sent directly to the gas chambers. Father Isaac died shortly before the end of the war, on one of the notorious death marches. Thanks to the people currently living in the neighborhood, a sign and 4 commemorative stolpersteinen plaques inform us of the sad fate of the Cohen family. I was present when the sign was unveiled, together with 2 women who had been in the same class in school as Greetje. It was very touching, very moving. such civic initiatives are not only heartwarming, they also keep history alive and ensure that the names of Holocaust victims are not lost to oblivion. Something which is of great importance, certainly now that there are fewer and fewer eyewitnesses to those terrible events. The role of education in passing on the memory of the Holocaust will therefore only increase in the coming years. Because future generations must know and understand what happened. One example being the lesson offered by the Museum Kind in Oorlog, Child in Wartime. But a commemoration such as this also asks us to think about the here and now. We all have a responsibility to eradicate hate, discrimination and intolerance, and promote the peaceful coexistence of different groups of people. To combat polarization, local authorities have a very important part to play in that. In our international city of The Hague, we embrace differences and celebrate diversity. And that all based on the conviction that peace and justice can only be achieved in a society where every individual is treated with respect. In that spirit, I wish you a fitting commemoration.
We are very honored to have the international law community represented at such a high level, with the presence of the Secretary General of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, His Excellency Dr. Martin Čepelák. May I please welcome you to the podium.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to address you on behalf of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the oldest international court in existence. The court established here in The Hague 125 years ago. The court which gave The Hague a chance to become the city of international peace and justice. The court, who was given the Peace Palace for its headquarters, and which has been operating from here ever since, fulfilling its universal mission at service of international peace and justice. And in my capacity as Secretary General of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, I'm pleased to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. On January 27, 1945, the soldiers of the Red Army opened the gate of the German Nazi concentration and extermination camp called Auschwitz, where in the main camp they found about 7,000 survived prisoners. They remained there despite the evacuation and liquidation steps performed through middle of January 1945, because, in fact, the German leadership of the camp refrained from doing anything that would make it fully impossible for the camp to continue functioning. And this is how 7,000 remained, whilst about 56,000 other prisoners were led out of Auschwitz from January 17 to 21, 1945, under the escort of heavily armed SS troops. And let me quote the text prepared by the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum of former German Nazi concentration and extermination camp. So I quote, "Along all the routes, the escorting SS guards shot both the prisoners who tried to escape and those who were too physically exhausted to keep up with their fellow unfortunates. Thousands of corpses of the prisoners who were shot or who died of fatigue or exposure to the cold lined both the routes where they passed on foot or by train. In Upper Silesia alone, about 3,000 evacuated prisoners died. It is estimated that at least 9,000 and more probably 15,000 Auschwitz prisoners paid with their lives for the evacuation operation. After the war, the travails of the evacuated prisoners came to be known as the death marches." End of quote. One of two main evacuation routes led to Gliwice, the city in Upper Silesia, the city where I was born. Many victims of the death march died there and were buried on the main cemetery. Their graves are just few steps from those of my grandparents. Their graves told me for the first time in my life about the German Nazi concentration and extermination camp Auschwitz-Birkenau. Their graves told me for the first time in my life about the Holocaust. Once more, let me quote from the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum. "All over the world, Auschwitz has become a symbol of terror, genocide, and the Shoah. It was established by Germans in 1940 in the suburbs of Oświęcim, a Polish city that was annexed to the Third Reich by the Nazis. Its name was changed to Auschwitz, which also became the name of Konzentrationslager Auschwitz. The direct reason for the establishment of the camp was the fact that the mass arrests of Poles were increasing beyond the capacity of existing local prisons. The first transport of Poles reached Karl Auschwitz from Tarnów prison on June 14, 1940. So initially, Auschwitz was to be one more concentration camp of the type that the Nazis had been setting up since the early 1930s. It functioned in its role throughout its existence, even when, beginning in 1942, it also became the largest of the extermination centers where the Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution of the Jewish question, the Nazi plan to murder European Jews, was carried out. End of quote. Indeed, all over the world, Auschwitz has become a symbol of terror, genocide, and the Shoah. What is a symbol? It is an element which represents the whole, because the whole cannot be comprehended. The symbols refers beyond itself. The role of the symbol is not to help us to understand, but to remember. And so we are here to remember. But what does it mean to remember? It does not mean to have recollections of some kind. Remembrance, this is a decision. And so we have decided not to forget. This is why I see you, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my friends. Yes, I'm proud to see many of my friends, ambassadors, rabbis, Rabbi Avraham Sutendorp, Rabbi Binyamin Jacobs, and many others. We are all have decided to remember. And this is why we are here today. But if we decided to remember, this has one more consequence. We have also decided to confront us with Holocaust. It's not easy, but we need to confront us with the Shoah. As individuals, as societies, as nations, and as humanity. Now I'm here in my capacity of the Secretary General of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, founded by the Hague Peace Conferences, which had also attempted to develop the laws of war and to regulate the conduct of warfare, and therefore I'm particularly aware that the international law must also confront itself with the Shoah. What is the international law after the Holocaust? After Raphael Lemkin introduced the notion of genocide, after the Nuremberg trial, after the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Well, very soon the distinguished Professor Tom Ginsburg will confront the international law with the Holocaust in his keynote address. So it is a time for me to leave and to thank you.
Thank you. This evening, we are proud to have the presence of the Honorable Dineke de Groot, the President of the Supreme Court of the Netherlands. She will introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Thomas Ginsburg. Thereafter, Professor Ginsburg will give the keynote address, The Holocaust and the Age of Rights. I am pleased to invite Professor de Groot to the podium.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear attendees, it's a great honor to introduce today's speaker, Tom Ginsburg, to you at the 6th annual The Hague commemoration on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Tom Ginsburg and I met at the celebration of the 14th judicial year of the Constitutional Court of Kosovo. The 14th judicial year of the Constitutional Court of Kosovo was only in October 2023. This annual lecture aims to delve into the profound impact of the Holocaust on international law, providing a meaningful platform for commemoration. On this platform, we honor the memory of those who did not survive the Holocaust, and of all those who suffered from it. It is up to us to ensure that their narratives are kept alive. This platform also inspires by lectures on how to prevent what should never have happened from happening again. Today, Tom Ginsburg takes us down a path where global standards of human rights meaningfully contribute to problem solving and justice. Tom Ginsburg is the Leo Spitz Distinguished Service Professor of International Law at the University of Chicago, where he also serves as faculty director for the Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression. He holds BA, JD, and PhD degrees from the University of California at Berkeley, and currently co-directs the Comparative Constitutions Project, which catalogues the world's constitutions since 1789. His latest book is Democracies and International Law, winner of Best Book prizes from the American branch of the International Law Association and the American Society for International Law. He is the author or editor of over 25 other books, including How to Save a Constitutional Democracy with Aziz Hook, winner of the Best Book Prize from the International Society for Constitutional Law, The Endurance of National Constitutions and Judicial Review in New Democracies, the latter two both winning Best Book awards from the American Political Science Association. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And before entering law teaching, he served as a legal advisor at the Iran-US Claims Tribunal here in The Hague, and currently serves as a senior advisor on constitution building to the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, an organization that supports democracy worldwide. Professor Ginsberg, we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. Thanks to you all for being here. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here to help commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day here in The Hague. And I actually want to start by mentioning a distinguished jurist who I was privileged to know, who passed away this last year at the age of 89. Thomas Buergenthal, who himself was one of those people who was liberated on January 1945 from Auschwitz when he was a young man. And he went on to become a well-known professor of international law in the United States, focused mainly on human rights. He then served in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights when it was first started, and towards the end of his career spent 10 years in this building as a judge on the International Court of Justice. He was someone who played a tremendous role in setting up and building our institutions for human rights, and he did that precisely because of his experience. And so I think it's quite important to remember him on this day. At the end of the program, we're going to hear more about Tom and his life. His life spanned the transformation of European Jews. And as I will argue, it was a period in which European Jews were also transformational for international law, building a system in which we now can think of what was novel, what was not even really discussed much before World War II, before the Holocaust, which was the idea that every single human on earth, by virtue of their humanity, is entitled to human dignity and is entitled to rights on the international plane. That's a new development that came out of the Holocaust, and that's what I would like to talk about today. My talk will have three short parts. I want to first talk about the history of rights in general, and my theme is the relationship between what we might call cosmopolitanism and particularism. Cosmopolitanism, the idea that we should care about the rights and interests of faraway people that we have never met, the idea that we are all members in some sense of a human family, the idea I could trace back actually to the book of Genesis, that we are all made b'tselem Elohim, that we are all made in the image of God and thus entitled to human dignity. With particularism, and this is the history of the world in which we have groups, we have identities, and sometimes we fight with each other over those things, but those identities can also be the basis for rights and the basis for advancing justice. And so there's a tension in philosophy and law about between cosmopolitanism and particularism, and that will be a theme I pursue in each of the three parts. So I'll start by talking about rights. I then would like to talk about the role of Jewish jurists in building our modern system of rights. The lecture is co-sponsored by the Jewish community of The Hague, a community in which I was privileged to live 25 years ago for a couple of years. And, that was a tremendous, I should say, opportunity for me to meet the people who had survived. And they'd survived by virtue of their Dutch Christian neighbors taking care of them, some of them, because they had a cosmopolitan vision. They survived by running away to countries which were welcoming of refugees. And of course, they were the minority. But to hear their stories, was extremely important for me. After I speak a bit about the role of the Jewish lawyers, I will talk about the influence of cosmopolitan ideas on national projects. Cosmopolitan liberalism seeks to limit the power of states to mistreat their own citizens. And once the human rights movement developed, we learned, of course, that states had been the greatest threats to rights. You can't get the Holocaust without state power, without the ability to mobilize mass killing on such a scale. And yet states are also the vehicle for the protection of rights. And so I want to talk a bit about, in particular, the role of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in motivating state action thereafter. And I note here that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was celebrated its 75th anniversary just last month. So it's another anniversary of something that emerged from the horrors of the Holocaust. First, let me say a bit about the history of rights. It's a very ancient idea that people that should have some form of human dignity. But the first projects to write down rights were essentially national in character. The English Bill of Rights is a list of rights. My own country's founding fathers, in the American states in particular, were the first to really articulate lists of rights that they thought were particular to them. They were not speaking really of rights that would belong to everybody. They wanted the rights, actually what they wanted was the rights of Englishmen. They wanted to be treated equally to the people from England, who was their colonial power, their colonial master. And they also had the idea that you could enumerate specific rights. They weren't just out there amorphous, sort of a natural law idea. They were something to be adopted by us for our community in a particularistic kind of way. Famously, these founding fathers are juxtaposed against the French drafters of the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution, 1789, 1791. And that document, of course, speaks more broadly. It speaks in universal language. But despite its soaring language, we know that that document was not extended. It was the Declaration of the Rights of Man, not women. It was not extended to the French colonies, the enslaved people in places like Haiti. And the hypocrisy here between what the words were on paper and actually the lived experience is actually what motivated the Haitians to have a racial revolution in which they took their own country and then were themselves leaders in articulating national rights. Many of our rights I've shown in other work. When you look at the catalog of all constitutional rights in the world that we have, quite a number were actually invented in Haiti in reaction, in some sense, to their being left out of the Universal Declaration. The 19th century was a world in which rights were seen as national. National constitutions contained the rights of Bolivians and Belgians, Swedes and Swiss and Spanish, but they weren't yet speaking about the rights of everyone. Yet the 19th century was also the beginning of transnational movements for rights, for human rights. And actually, I will focus on two sources of those. One was the transatlantic slave trade, which was known to people, or thought by many people, to be a great evil, and one that by its nature crossed borders and implicated many states. And so social movements formed to fight the transatlantic slave trade. And eventually they got the British government to take a role in enforcing and trying to shut down the transatlantic slave trade. The British ships stopped something like 600 ships of carrying enslaved people across the Atlantic, prosecuted them, took the boats, and freed roughly 80,000 enslaved people and brought them back to Africa. So this was the first effort, in some sense, to have an international enforcement or transnational enforcement. The British citizens, by virtue of their government, were saying that they cared about the rights of people who were not their country people, not their co-nationals. Jews also occupied an important place in the history of the development of rights thinking. And this was, of course, because the position of Jews in Europe during an era of massive development of territorial nationalism was an awkward one. The 19th century is when we see Europe become a land of peoples, where everyone has their own place. And then what do you do, of course, for the people without a land? The Jews and the Roma didn't fit nicely into the emerging European structure of nation states as the empires broke apart. And that led, of course, to a couple of different responses. One is naturally the Zionist project, which is to say, well, land without a people was the phrase for people without a land. That's not quite accurate as a statement, but the idea that if the world is going to be divided into territorial nation states, then it does require a land. That's a particularist kind of solution. There was another particularist kind of solution which really was very important in the development of international law, and that is a regime known as the minorities treaties. The picture on the top there is the Versailles Conference, where ideas of self-determination were articulated, and that led to a massive number of different nationalities coming to the Americans, coming to the French, and saying, we want a country for ourselves. Kurds and Croats and all kinds of peoples thought, well, if we're going to have self-determination, if we're handing out countries, we need one. Again, the problem for Jews is they didn't have a place, same with the Roma. And so, but even for the peoples that did have a place, there was this problem because, of course, national borders are never perfectly articulated. If Hungary was for the Hungarians and Romania was for the Romanians, what about the Hungarians in Romania and vice versa? The system they developed was called the minorities regime. And what it was a series of treaties concluded among countries, among new countries, but also with the imperial powers, the United States and the United Kingdom, in which those powers solicited from the new nations in Europe and also Iraq, Turkey, that they would promise to treat their minorities well. And if they didn't do so, there was the possibility of complaint right across the way there. The League of Nations itself was also supposed to protect, and those outside countries would act as guarantors that states would treat their minorities well. The image on the bottom there is of a Jewish school in Poland. Jews were protected by this regime, and it is sort of an alternative, particularistic way of thinking about rights. It's different from our world. It's one in which people get rights, collective rights, like the right to teach your children in your own language, the rights to have schools in your own language and such. And you get them because of your membership in a group. They are group rights guaranteed by particular outside powers. It's a particularistic way to structure a rights regime. Particular guarantors, particular rights for particular peoples. It's not yet the universal world we live in. I sometimes speculate what might have happened if that system had worked. Where would our world be? Would we have come to the place where we are, where we think of something like a universal declaration of rights, where we have a set of mechanisms thinking about rights of people far, far away? It might have taken longer. But in any case, we don't have to, we know that history did happen, and the Holocaust did happen. And so this regime was never to be really effective. And it's only out of the horrors of the Holocaust that we get the next system. Let me turn to the second part of my talk, which is the role of the Jewish lawyers in this very construction. And Tom Buergenthal, of course, was one of them. But there were others. The man in the sepia is the very famous Raphael Lemkin, who Secretary General just mentioned, who was a Polish Jew, who himself became interested in human rights problems by hearing about the Armenian genocide when he was a young man. And he was shocked that there was no international mechanism to punish those responsible. And he spent the rest of his life trying to create such a mechanism. In 1944, he gives us the word genocide. He invented the word genocide, and he defined it. And he went on to advise the punishment of the Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg, but also the creation of the Genocide Convention, which is one of the pieces of the post-war architecture. The man in the upper left was Buergenthal's mentor, a man named Louis Henkin, a very famous scholar of human rights. Also, actually all of these men, born in Europe, all of them lost their families, and all of them took that energy and tried to build the universal system. In the upper right is Egon Schwelb, who headed the United Nations Human Rights Division when the United Nations was created, with a promise to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights as one of its fundamental purposes. So trying to give some structure to that within the UN system. The man in the small circle in the center is Jacob Robinson, who also worked in the United Nations on the Commission for Human Rights, which was the body which articulated the Universal Declaration. He also, interestingly, served as Israel's first legal advisor at the United Nations. And it's a theme of many of these men that they both saw themselves as Zionists or contributing to that project as well as contributing to a global project. Universalism and particularism did not present, I think, the conceptual challenges they might to us today. The man in the lower right, René Cassin, the French delegate to the drafting of the Universal Declaration. And finally, in the lower left, the very famous judge Hirsch Lauterpacht, who also served in that building there, one of the great founding figures of constructing international law, who wrote a famous book called A Bill of Rights for Man in 1944, a kind of precursor to the idea of the Universal Declaration. And indeed, he's one of many different groups, including the American Jewish Committee and the president of my university, Robert Hutchins. Lots of people were suggesting what might go in to a global Bill of Rights. Lauterpacht's life sort of follows the trajectory of the others in that he was born in Galicia and suffered very much from anti-Semitism as a young man, but then went on to try to build this broader structure. The Lauterpacht's idea was that there would be rights that every single person got by virtue of their humanity, and that the United Nations would play a strong role in defending those. That people would be able to petition to the United Nations, that the Security Council might intervene, that we might actually have a strong and robust enforcement system of human rights. And that did not, in the end, come to be. He himself was quite upset, in some sense, with the Universal Declaration as it finally came to emerge, precisely because it did not contain an enforcement mechanism. The Universal Declaration is a simple declaration, 30 articles articulating the rights to which we should all benefit, rights to speak, rights to housing, etc. But it did not contain in itself an enforcement mechanism as adopted. Let me say a bit about it. It was part of the construction of a broader architecture. That would include the United Nations itself, the Genocide Convention, the Nuremberg trials, the idea that individuals could be responsible for what they had done. But the thought about the Universal Declaration was that it should be as simple as possible, something everyone could understand. And when I think about it now, I think the mechanism they were thinking of was culture. If you could get every single person, on earth to read it, and they translated to many, many languages. They had on the drafting committee people from different cultures. They debated. They were trying to have a pluralism of a minimum core of rights on which we could all agree. And their theory is that just by doing that, it would make a difference. Lauterpacht thought it wasn't enough. You needed enforcement. You needed binding treaties. You needed real law. You needed other structures. Let me turn now to my third point, really, which is about, exactly how this Universal Declaration has shaped national action. And here I want to focus again on universalism and particularism. The Declaration obviously embodies universalism. Every single person has these rights. How is it meant to actually function? Culture is fine. Getting everyone to agree is fine. But at the end of the day, we know, and we have learned over and over again since 1948, that governments and others that will abuse human rights. President de Groot mentioned Kosovo, which is a very interesting and rare example of a country where they were under the threat of genocide. And the international community actually intervened in a country, Serbia, and broke off part of it to set up a new country, to give them a country. And that's pretty rare that there's that kind of use of force. We must rely on more mundane mechanisms, lawsuits, treaties, and other things. Now here, my view is that the international machinery that we have developed, and I don't have time to develop this completely, but it tends to be pretty weak. The United Nations is better at promises than implementation. It has a large machinery. It's not always pretty. The Human Rights Council, if you look at the states which are members of that body, are mostly human rights abusers. And it requires, I think, something more to actually move forward on the promise of the Universal Declaration. To my mind, this is where particular projects come in mind. And I want to focus on the main thing I study, which is national constitutions. National constitutions are an important mechanism for articulating rights on a national plane. And of course, within viable legal systems, of which not everyone is, but you at least have the possibility of using those to advance certain rights. In Europe, obviously, we have transnational systems, the European Court of Human Rights, the European Union and such. But for most of the world, those things are very thin. And so we rely in the end on our governments. Here, I want to argue that the Universal Declaration, with its cosmopolitan vision, has had impact and has shaped people's consciousness through its effect on national constitutions. So what I do is I look, first of all, at rights in national constitutions. And this is what Louis Henkin called the age of rights. We are in an age where there are many international treaties, but there's also many more rights, and our concepts of rights are always changing. This figure shows the average number of rights in a national constitution. It was 22 or so in 1948. It's almost 50 now. People make new kinds of claims with rights. Right to internet use is something now we see. Rights to same-sex equality we wouldn't have seen in 1948. Rights of future generations. Rights to be protected against climate change. The rights of nature herself as an embodier of rights, a subject of rights. We're seeing a lot of articulation, and this is why we are in the age of rights. We remain in the age where people care about rights and they want to articulate them, and constitutions are expanding. What I did is look at the rights that were present in some quantity in national constitutions in 1948 and separate them between those that were included in the Universal Declaration and those that were not. They were sitting around debating, which should we include, which should we not? The things that were included formed a kind of a template thereafter for national constitution makers. So if it was included, it was likely to be brought into particular national law as a particular set of national rights. If it was excluded, it would not. And there's one very interesting example. At the very last minute, they excluded the right to petition, the right to petition. Now, the right to petition is a very ancient right where you could petition the government when you're upset with something. But they were, in the discussion we can read, they were kind of misunderstanding it. They thought it was a right to petition the United Nations in the sense that Lauterpacht wanted it to be. And they said, oh, we couldn't have the UN actually enforce these things, so let's exclude that one. And that right it sort of disappears. It's not included when countries draft up constitutions today as it would have been. So the argument here is that by virtue of inclusion in this menu of rights, it obviously doesn't lead to automatic implementation. I would not be so naive as to suggest that. But it does mean that there is this kind of conversation between the cosmopolitan vision and the particular ones of national projects, and where the actual legal enforcement machinery is, which is at the national level, is informed by these efforts at aspiration at the universal. Now, before concluding, I want to say that, it's a commonplace we all know that rights remain woefully under-enforced in our deeply broken world. The last year saw the biggest increase in the number of refugees in history, 36 million refugees, 80 or 90 million internally displaced people around the world. War is going on, obviously, in Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, Israel, and Gaza. All of these places have refugees and people who've been displaced. All of these places are suffering human rights abuses, and human rights conditions are poor. Even in rich democracies like the Netherlands and the United States, we struggle to deliver fully on the rights that we promise. But my point is that without the aspiration, we don't have anything to work towards. Sometimes law has to be ahead of society. Sometimes we have to use law as a blueprint, not as an operating manual. That is, we have to have pieces of paper that inspire us to work towards something different, something better, not necessarily describing the world as it is. And that is a role for law, not just as something that's enforceable. We can neither reject, in my view, the cosmopolitanism of global aspiration, nor the particular national projects which are so necessary to actually make a difference on the ground. I want to close actually by turning back to Tom Buergenthal. And I think of him and his time in this building, and I think of us in this building now. And it reminds me we're all sort of bricks in this wall of history. We're working towards something. We're building something, building a better world. And you often can't see it if you're just one brick in the wall. He was a constant optimist, and I think it's a nice thing to close on, this quote from him. The task ahead is to strengthen the tools, not to despair, and never to believe that mankind is incapable of creating a world in which our grandchildren and their descendants can live in peace and enjoy the human rights that were denied to so many of his generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President de Groot. Thank you, Professor Ginsburg. Reflections will be given by Dr. Karin van Leeuwen. Dr. van Leeuwen, I invite you up to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear Tom. First of all, I thank you with the other speakers of today for allowing me to share a few reflections on these words just spoken by our key lecturer, Tom Ginsburg, during this, of course, very important event. And I will do so as a humble historian who takes a fascination in law and the things that lawyers do with it. And doing so, I will try to follow some of the key points of his lecture and first say a few words on this universalist project of international law, in which, of course, the UN Declaration finds its roots, but then also move to the impact of these universalist instruments on national constitutions. Now, starting with this universalist promise or cosmopolitan take on law, and maybe also its weaknesses, on which Tom just reflected, let me say a few words on today's venue. And now I'm not talking about the great palace over there, but actually this place, the Academy building, that in a different shapes has stood next to the Peace Palace for almost a century now. For when we speak about this promise of universalism embodied by the Peace Palace since the early 20th century, I think it is important to also go back to some of the founding fathers of this promise, amongst whom we find Actually, also another prominent lawyer of Jewish descent, maybe not remained during his life, Tobias Asser. Now, many of us may be aware that Asser was fundamental in the establishment of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the first court to inhabit the Peace Palace, as well as in the establishment and development of many other legal instruments and institutions. But Asser was also among the first to acknowledge the limitations of such legal instruments in a world of powerful states, or empires actually, in his time. Hence, he invested part of his Nobel Peace Prize money and some of his very last energy in the accompanying project of setting up the Hague Academy as a space of encounter for diplomats and legal scholars, and thus a breeding space for what later on historian Maartje Abbenhuis has described as the spirit of the Hague. The spirit describing some kind of expectation or something that went beyond, let's say, the black letter law and described a kind of expectation that something bigger and all-encompassing would grow out of the emerging project of international law. And that states, either in court, but maybe also more broadly in public debate, could be actually held accountable for violating emerging laws and principles. And I think that is also what very much this academy symbolizes, that for many of its founding fathers, this promise of universalism was a work in progress. And people like Asser considered dialogue, even among the most divergent views, as maybe the most important means to achieve such progress. So even if this promise of universalism, and I think you alluded to that at the end of your speech, hasn't fully delivered even until today, it is important to realize that meetings such as today's may just be as important to achieve that as the actual legal rules. And I must add, and I come to my second and maybe a bit more substantial point that I feel even more humbled to being asked here to respond. Well, now I'm losing my track. My second point is about the impact of international law and human rights, more specifically on national constitutions. And here, of course, I'm not even trying to measure myself with Tom's knowledge from this impressive and vast research project on national constitutions of the world, as well as his hands-on experience with constitution making in states such as Tuvalu. As a historian who has specialized actually in mostly one constitution only, that of the Netherlands, I'm in no position to challenge any of his findings, but instead what I will do is use my observations from detailed archival work to further illustrate his main point and to reflect on, well, maybe an unexpected link actually to the Holocaust and the way it is remembered. Now, when I say that also the Dutch constitution to a large extent owes its current rights catalogue to international human rights instruments such as the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, this might sound somewhat counterintuitive. For, well, maybe it's first of all a bit hard to fit with this Dutch reputation as forerunners of international justice. But secondly, also, of course, we know that the Dutch constitution itself has actually some very long roots, being among the oldest of the world. And indeed, some rights, such as the historically quite crucial freedom of religion, already do date back to this first incarnation of the current constitution from 1814. But nevertheless, many other rights, including the nowadays very prominent Article 1 on non-discrimination, do actually owe a lot to the development of international legal instruments. In fact, when in the early 1950s this instrument just had seen the light, Dutch jurists and politicians even deliberately made the choice not to incorporate principles such as non-discrimination or equality in the Constitution. And I highlight that here because I think the reasoning they gave for that is actually quite telling about the worldview in which also this UN Declaration of Human Rights rooted, of course, next to the very crucial never again sentiments that we've also inspired today's event. For that worldview, next to building on these terrible experiences, also that worldview was deeply Eurocentric, we can say, and this very much at least also resonated in the Dutch debates. For when in the 1950s, talking about maybe including these rights in the Constitution, a Dutch woman argued that, well, maybe it would be a good idea to include some right to equality in the Constitution. The men in her committee basically said, well, we don't need them in this country. They were considered, these rights were considered, as Barbara Omen has so well put it, as rights for others. Read, let's say, the global south, basically. Of course, the women, and in this case, this woman, Hermine Revers, she knew better. I mean, it was certainly not the case that these rights had already been realized in the Netherlands. And so did, for example, also the Moluccans, who in vain tried to invoke rights to equal treatment before the courts in the Netherlands in the 1950s, when it came to their freedom to receive visitors in the camps in which they were housed. But these claims all fell flat in the 1950s on the ideas that these rights were not needed in the Netherlands. So it was not until the 1980s that indeed more rights, including the famous right to non-discrimination and the right to demonstrate, were incorporated in the Dutch constitution. And in particular for the former, so this non-discrimination right, UN instruments such as the right to racial equality proved an important source of inspiration. So the Netherlands in this sense perfectly fits the pattern observed by Tom for so many other constitutions. As said, the availability of human rights instruments was an important context in which this universal or constitutional change took place. But on top of that, I think it is also no coincidence that in the meantime, so let's say between this 1950s rejection of rights and their 1980s inclusion in the Constitution, the Dutch remembrance of the Second World War and the Holocaust had fundamentally changed into a more self-critical perspective. Now, I think we all realize that the inclusion of these rights in a constitution like the Dutch constitution, and maybe in the Netherlands in particular, does not mean the work is done. I'd say the Netherlands in particular, because there's also no constitutional review to uphold these rights in court. And maybe in this light, the deliberate choice of previous generations to develop both national, European, and international safeguards should be cherished more. And even if that promise of universalism doesn't yet fully deliver, we may, in the spirit of people like Asser, nevertheless help furthering it by engaging in exchanges such as today's. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. van Leeuwen. His Excellency Ambassador Modi Ephraim will lead the commemorative moment, but first I would like to invite Gabrielle and Livia Locker, age 12, up here to light our 6 candles. During the candle lighting, we will listen to the musical interlude by Naomi van Hessen on violin and Arkady Blecherov on viola. I invite His Excellency, Ambassador Ephraim, to the podium.
Excellencies, judges, rabbis, scholars, distinguished guests, good evening. We've gathered here this evening in The Hague to commemorate the 79th year since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, when, as we heard before, 7,000 Jews were saved, but 6 million Jewish men, women and children were murdered in the worst genocide in human history. The majority of the Jewish population in the Netherlands perished in the Shoah, and most of the Jewish communities in this country ceased to exist. To the memory of the 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust, we have just lit 6 candles. The small lights served to commemorate and to remind us to keep a glimmer of hope. Dear friends, while we cannot fully process the cruelty of this magnitude, we can only understand the Holocaust one story at a time. And one of those stories is the story of 2 Jewish girls from Romania, both of them called Ruth. My mother, Ruth, was 5 years old when the Holocaust began. She was the only child to her parents, Leah and Avner, and the family lived in Chernovitz. In 1940, the Soviet Union occupied Chernovitz, and a year later, in 1941, in the beginning of the Operation Barbarossa, the city was retaken by Romania, which had become an ally of Nazi Germany. The Jews of the city were put in a ghetto, and Ruth's father, my grandfather Avner, was murdered by the Nazis. At the age of 7 years old, Ruth had to flee for her life with her mother and constantly moved from one place to another in order not to get caught by the Nazis. After the war, my mother and my grandmother fortunately managed to escape to Israel by boat. And before she passed away, my mother always told me, I'm happy that I was able to have a big and nice family after surviving the horrors of the Holocaust. Over 300,000 Romanian Jews were murdered during the Shoah. The other Jewish girl from Bucharest, Romania, is Ruth Haran. She survived the Holocaust in Romania, and like my mother, managed to escape to Israel. And she lives today, at the age of 87, in Kibbutz Be'eri with her family. Recently, on October 7th, Jews were once again target of a pogrom, where the Hamas terrorists carried out barbaric massacre on the streets and in homes in southern Israel, killing more than 1,200 men, women, and children. Since the Holocaust, this is the highest number of Jews murdered in one day. Until now, the Hamas is keeping in hostage 136 Israelis in Gaza. During the October 7th massacre, Ruth hid in her home in Be'eri while her son and 2 other family members were murdered. And 7 other family members were taken hostage by Hamas terrorists. Ruth said, as a child, we ran away and did not have a home. This time, I will not run away again. I will return to my home. I want to go back home. After the horrors of the Holocaust, we said, and as it was mentioned here before, never again. But as we say, never again is now. The difference between then and now is that we now have a sovereign country with an army that can defend itself. We uphold the promise of never again and will never allow another Holocaust to happen. We pay a high price for that, but we fight for our future. Never again we will fall victim to the terror of Hamas. The IDF strives to defend its citizens and fight Hamas terrorists that hide among civilians. Hamas has said they want to repeat the atrocities of October 7th. Their genocidal agenda is clear to everyone. Israel is fighting a just war in order to free the hostages and make sure a pogrom like the one took place on October 7th can never happen again. To call the self-defense of Israel a genocide is a perversion of the term that, as we heard Professor Ginsburg, was coined and adapted following the Holocaust. It is an injustice against the victims of those who did suffer in genocide. Later on in the program, we will watch the film From Auschwitz to the International Court of Justice as a tribute to Judge Thomas Buergenthal, and we heard some of his achievements for human rights from Professor Ginsburg. The story of Judge Buergenthal is remarkable. He spent the first 11 years of his life under the Nazi regime. He was one of the few children who survived the death march from Auschwitz. Having served as a judge for many years, including here in the International Court of Justice, Buergenthal was a champion of human rights. As he wrote in his memoir, A Lucky Child, my Holocaust experience has had a very substantial impact on the human being I have become. This is evident in his life's work as an international law professor, human rights lawyer, and international judge. Judge Buergenthal passed away in 2023. The events that took place during the Holocaust continue to leave an impact on generations of descendants of survivors. And I can tell you this evening that globally, but also here in the Netherlands, there is now a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism. On the street, we saw a few days ago, protests where Hamas terror is praised and anti-Semitic slogans are shouted. When we remember the horrors of the Shoah, we have to commit ourselves to never again. That means standing together and taking a stand against anti-Semitism. The Jewish community all over the world should feel like any other group. We cannot allow this hatred to manifest. I'm reminded of the word of Elie Wiesel. Never again is more than a slogan. It is a prayer, a promise, a vow. We have come here this evening not just to commemorate the Holocaust, but to remind each other that the Shoah may never be allowed to happen again. And indeed, never again is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We come now to a special moment, another special moment in tonight's program, the video tribute to the aforementioned Judge Thomas Buergenthal. The film has been especially produced by Nathalie Tosita. At the end of your booklet is additional information about the film.
It was that anniversary visit to the anniversary of the Death March in midwinter in 2000. And then we came back to the hotel in Krakow, and we were at dinner that evening, and Tom was called to the telephone.
And I get a telephone call. I'm asked to go to receive the call, and it's the legal advisor of the State Department saying, I want you to know that we are nominating you to the International Court of Justice, but you can't tell anybody until Monday. And so I said, what about my wife? Oh yes, you can tell her.
He was extremely happy. He had never dreamt that this would happen to him. He had always aspired. I think every international lawyer believes that that is the crowning glory of a career, would be to be on the International Court of Justice.
This was so close to the place where the worst things that happened to me, and at the same time, the sort of greatest honor that I could get is just, we were in Krakow, it's very close to Auschwitz. So it was a special evening.
Ja, das stimmt.
Well, I'll cut your piece.
Oh, put it.
With your babas.
Peggy, eating, as usual. Okay, we go down. You want to come down too, Peggy? Or?
Yeah, I'll come in a second.
Okay.
My Holocaust experience has had a very substantial impact on the human being I have become. In any event, it equipped me to be a better human rights lawyer, if only because I understood, not only intellectually, but also emotionally, what it is like to be a victim of human rights violations. I could, after all, feel it in my bones. That goes back to the fact that the past was always present with me. But it wasn't as present as with many people who became depressed and it affected them. It was something that was there, just like when somebody has a permanent pain and it doesn't want to go away, but you don't let it affect you. And I really didn't let it, I wasn't going to let it affect me. I thought if I did let it affect me, the Germans would have won.
The different books in translation.
All of this.
Even when I tell the story, I am, you know, when I wrote the book at times, I thought, has this really happened to me? It was a sport for me to beat Hitler. I mean, it wasn't easy, but that again is the advantage of being a child. Because I really didn't have a life beforehand. So the camp was my life, really. And the trick was to stay alive. The Germans were very organized in their cruelty. They would kill older people, people who couldn't work, children. They would automatically they had a crematorium, a gas chamber, and they got other people to do their dirty work. I believe that if the environment is right, if you have a Hitler and the country begins to turn towards this sort of fascist mentality, then people will do usually whatever they're told to do. We think that we would never be able to do these things. On the other hand, a lot of normal Germans did things that they probably would never have done if there had been a different environment, different background. All of this creates this terrible barbarity that they committed. You'll see that the four of us get together and there's trouble. Wanted to tell the story. It was really designed only for my children. It was supposed to be letters to my sons.
You know, my father has done a lot of things professionally, and I think people really respect the work he's done, and he's definitely known in circles for human rights and those types of things. But I know him as my father. He's my father first, and so for us to show that side of him is important as well.
I wanted to tell about my parents, about what it was like, and what it was like in the camps experience. Hopefully some impact on this not happening again to other people.
It was a big deal what happened to him. But, you know, what he didn't want us to is to revel in the past and to have hatred. The idea was that you have to be optimistic about the future and you have to do something to help make the world a better place.
To the memory of my parents, Mundek and Gerda Buergenthal, whose love, strength of character, and integrity inspired me.
Even on the death march, he was saying, Hitler will not beat me. Yeah.
I was the only one that escaped from that. Because, and I still to this day don't know. It's always something that I think about. I say to the captain, Herr Hauptmann, ich kann arbeiten. What went through this murderer's mind to let me live?
That affects him. It's that particular brutality of all the children, little ones, being taken to the cemetery and blown up with hand grenades. I mean, it's...
People write me letters who read the book, and they say, no, you shouldn't say it's luck, it is divine intervention. As if they thought that I could be so arrogant to believe that if there is a God, that the God picked me out and let 1.25 million Jewish children die? It's luck. Given where I came from and given my experience, just to sit in The Hague and you see that magnificent hall with all of this, and to say to yourself, is this really true or am I dreaming? How did I get here? And I'm the American judge. And 70 years ago, I was a Jew in a German concentration camp.
You know, human rights is just the way he lives. That's not just his job, it's what he does. And so that makes him, you know, a big part of who he is.
The message was not one of hatred of Germans or anything else. It was the hatred of an ideological movement. It was the hatred of cruel people. I mean, it was a hatred of murderers. That was clear. But it wasn't an upbringing that would want you to be angry every day. It was an upbringing that was optimistic every day, that was hopeful, and that was empowering. I mean, the idea was to just do something better to help someone in any way possible. It could be one person, if you wanted. It could be a community. It could be, you know, trying to have an impact on a system, on a process, but just do something better.
I think the very fact that he would pursue international law and international human rights law is very telling, because it shows a desire that this will never happen to anybody else again if he can possibly help to avoid it.
When I will speak also at the UN, I mentioned the children and what the world lost. Can you imagine 1 million children, what they could have become, what the world lost? The doctors, all of the things, the teachers, the professors, all of these millions of children, what they could have become, what the world could have benefited. How many of them might have won Nobel Peace Prizes? I wanted to study international law because I knew that that's a field in which I could contribute something more than other people. And not that I was going to save the world, but I felt this is something I could do. I mean, in the back of my mind was prevent war.
Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the conclusion of tonight's gathering. I invite Rabbi Katzman to the stage to close the event, and thereafter all of you are invited to the reception in the foyer to exchange thoughts and ideas while enjoying a drink. Everything being served is kosher. Thank you, good evening, and for later, wel thuis. Rabbi Katzman.
Thank you, Laura. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard and seen a lot tonight. Today's program focused on the age of rights. Professor Ginsburg shared with us the juxtaposition between universalism and particularism. For a brief moment, I would want to focus on another set of words: rights versus duties. Rights are things we claim. Duties call us to purpose. Classic Jewish ethical writings talk in terms of responsibilities, duties, and obligations rather than in the language of rights. Conflicting rights are almost impossible to reconcile. A conflict of rights is one in which neither side can afford to compromise. By just barely recognizing the legitimacy of competing claims, each side risks losing and diminishing their own rights. A conflict of duties, on the other hand, is something which we deal with on a daily basis. A teacher's duty to her classroom and to her own children. Our loyalty to our employer and our colleagues, and our loyalty to our families and friends. We juggle such competing claims all the time, and they may be difficult, but they're not insoluble. Honored judges, distinguished ambassadors, learned professors, and dear listeners, when we contemplate the impact of the Holocaust on the development of international law, we must realize that to prevent horrific crimes from happening, young people must learn and must be educated to live a life of purpose with a consciousness of duty and responsibility. Judge Buergenthal demonstrated so consistently. Even luck has a purpose. And maybe, just maybe, it's not so random after all. Responsibility to whom, you ask? The insights we heard today can help. Ironically, the most effective way to develop a moral concern for universal values is actually by being particularistic. Because we know what it is to be a parent, to love our own children, and to care for them, we also know, we can understand what it's like for someone else, somewhere else, to be a parent and care for his or her children. Because we know what it's like to care and protect a vulnerable parent or neighbor, we understand what it is for someone else, somewhere else, to care for their parent and their neighbor. Dr. Cheplock illustrated his very personal journey to learn the massivity of the Holocaust. The Jewish story starts with one couple, Abraham and Sarah, struggled to build a family. They went on to form a tribe and then a collection of tribes. Finally, a nation emerged. The impact of their teachings spanned the globe. They set out on a mission with a promise from the Almighty. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. Va'avarcha mevarcheka, mekalelcha aor, v'nivrchu v'cha kol mishpechot ha'adama. Those who bless you will be blessed. The one who curses you will be cursed. And all the families of the earth will bless themselves by you. When we lose that personal touch, when we forget the particularistic origin of moral guidelines, we end up in a backwards world, in a world where we can have these 6 portraits, 6 set of eyes staring at us for the second time in one lifetime with a painful question to the world. Are you acting on your duty? Are you meeting your responsibility to the promise you made, never again? And we have no answers. When we lose that personal calling, when we forget the responsibility that lays upon us, we end up in an upside-down world. We can have a journalist asking a representative of a country willing to release 150 prisoners for the exchange of the release of 50 hostages. Does that imply that in your consideration, the value of the lives of the prisoners is less than that of the hostages? When we use big words without allowing the meaning to reverberate in our heart and soul, with a twisted perception of the world, and where the victim of a genocidal attack is being accused of perpetrating one, while the actual perpetrator is celebrated as a freedom fighter. From the beginning of our history, the Jewish people have been called to be true to the covenant of Sinai, bringing the divine presence into this world through the things we do, not just the pronouncements we make, through the lives that we lead, through the love that we show, through the relationships that we form, through the care that we give, through the homes that we build, and through the shelter that we provide, through the communities that we create, and through the ideals that shine a light upon all around us. A candle ignited to serve one person will provide light to hundreds around him or her. I'd like to thank Mrs. Laura Renberg for guiding us through tonight's program, along with all the volunteers of Chai, the staff of the Embassy of Israel, and the Municipality of The Hague for organizing and hosting this lecture. I'd like to thank all present who made the effort to come, pay respect, and hopefully learn in honor of the victims. Special thanks to the contributors of tonight's program, Mayor van Zanen, Secretary General Marcin Cieplak, the Honorable President Dinke de Groot, and His Excellency Modi Ephraim, the Ambassador, Dr. Karin van Leeuwen, and Nathalie Tasuta for sharing with us those wonderful images. And of course, our guest lecturer, Professor Tom Ginsberg. Please join us outside for a snack and a drink. Everything, as has been said, everything is kosher. Good night and be a blessing.